AJ, how are you?
I'm well, David. Doing well. Good to be on with you again. Thanks for having me back.
Yeah, absolutely. So, what's new? You're the co-founder and CEO of ByteChek. So, listen, every time, we talked about the life in the startup world, right? Like a week is like, like dog years, right? A week is
Yes. Yeah.
like a year in a regular company, right? So, uh, how has it been? Like, what new and exciting things are you working on?
Yeah, it's been busy. It's been really busy, a lot of fun, but just extremely busy in a startup. The days just kind of run together. You're just doing so much. You're getting new customers at the same time trying to find new customers. It's been great. I actually was going so hard that I needed to take a break this past week. I just blocked off my calendar and took some time off on Friday and took some mental space because it's stressful running a company for sure. As you know, and doing the entrepreneurship route it can get to you. So with any startup, regardless of ByteChek or anything else, I definitely encourage people to take some time off when they need it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's kind of one of those, secrets, right? So in order for you to be a top performer, you also have to know when to take some time off. So I wanted to have this session specifically talking about cloud compliance. We're trying to demystify some of the areas, and there's nothing better than bringing somebody like yourself, who is basically an expert in the field, working as a consultant in the area of cloud compliance with a lot of large enterprise, and now running your own firm and being in the trenches of cloud compliance, basically.
Yeah.
So why don't we get started and then just ask the basic question? What is cloud compliance?
Yeah, I think the thing that often when people think about compliance and security in the cloud, they think it's significantly different. While it's different than how you evaluate things on premise, the overall concept are the same, right? It's compliance in the cloud is meeting some regular standard or framework based off of how you configure things. And the biggest challenge in the cloud is your responsibility shifts. It becomes very different what you have to be responsible for, as well as things that you have to think about. You didn't have to worry about open S3 buckets when you were hosting stuff in your own data center, but now you're hosting on AWS, you might have to consider that. And there's so compliance in the cloud, it still means compliance. It's still saying, hey, here's some standard, here's some framework, whether that's SOC 2, ISO, HIPAA, high trust, whatever it may be. Here's some standard up there, and you have to meet it. And the way that you go about doing that is using cloud resources, using some of the things that you have available to you on AWS. But the biggest difference is something that we can talk about today is the shared responsibility model. It's where is that line drawn for you versus the cloud provider, because the cloud provider does take some of those compliance responsibilities off your plate. Not all of them. That's the key thing to remember. Not all of those responsibilities off your plate. Just because you're hosted on AWS or Azure or GCP, that doesn't mean that you have now the same compliance frameworks that they have. You still have to do some of the work on your own, but they do take care of some of that. So for me, compliance in the cloud is the same as compliance on premise. You're meeting some standards. It's just how you think about it and how you set things up. It's a little bit different.
Now, when we think cloud, we think Amazon, AWS, Microsoft Azure, Google Cloud, and so on. Is there anything else that falls under that definition that we should consider?
Yeah, I think, a lot of the apps that we're using throughout our day-to-day life, especially nowadays, think about Zoom. How many times have you been on Zoom in just one day? That's hosted in the cloud. That's a cloud app. There's so many apps that you use that are hosted on an AWS and Azure, GCP, or et cetera. So something I tell people all the time is, even if the organization that you work at is not hosted on the cloud, the chances of you dealing with a cloud something in your environment are, I can put it at like a 99.9% chance you're going to have a tool that you're working with that is hosted in the cloud. So when we think about cloud, don't just think about the major cloud providers and infrastructure as a service perspective. Think about the apps you're using. Zoom's hosted on AWS last I checked. So even through using Zoom, you're still using AWS, and AWS is still the backbone. So understanding how AWS works, what are Zoom's responsibilities versus AWS's responsibilities, is important for any professionals to understand about the cloud.
And what about the first of all, private cloud, where companies host their own, and then maybe like a hybrid model where people using a kind of a private cloud in a public space. What about that?
Yeah, it's an interesting setup, and I know why some folks do it in some of these highly regulated environments where they have to maintain a little bit control. So they have their own private cloud, which when we think about the cloud is just somebody else's computer. So if you have your own private cloud, right? So when we say cloud for this, if there's anybody out there that doesn't really even they hear cloud all the time, right? There's a data center. There's some servers in there. Probably it's Linux more than likely. It's just a Linux computer somewhere, and that's what the cloud is. So if you're hosting your own private cloud, you have control over those physical resources. You have all of that stuff there, and maybe a central location. It doesn't necessarily have to be where all your employees are located. Especially nowadays with COVID, no one is located where their physical servers are. And sometimes that's done just because you have to, for some requirement, some law out there, have to maintain 100% control over your environment. But there are advantages to still using a piece of the public cloud infrastructure. One common example that I see oftentimes with people that are operating in a private cloud setup is they use S3 or they use some kind of storage solution on AWS for that more durable, long-term, cheaper storage, because it's hard to store significant amounts of data in an on-premise environment without your cost skyrocketing. So I can see the use case for it. What I would also challenge people if they're operating in a hybrid model is really uncover why that's necessary. If it's really just for comfort, if it's because somebody at the organization is like, I really want to keep this on-prem infrastructure just because I had it set up and I'm the only guy that knows how to use it, maybe you should think about moving that to the cloud. If you have to keep your stuff private and in private cloud because of regulatory things, that's, I get it. But I always challenge people whenever they're doing hybrid, private versus public cloud, and also multi-clouds. It's going to take a lot to convince me that you have to do those things, because you normally can knock out everything you need with one public cloud provider.
So companies that do multi-cloud, you're not supporting that, or not as much?
I'm not a fan, man. I'm not a fan. I think you're setting yourself up for failure for a few reasons. One, anybody that's really good at the cloud is good at one cloud provider. I don't know. I know a few unicorns out there. Chris Hughes is one that is really good at AWS and knows Azure, but most people are really good at one cloud provider. So if you have a team of engineers, you have your team, and you're thinking, everything in security comes back to the people. How are you treating your people? You're now going to take people that have focused on AWS and say, hey, I also need you to know Azure too at the same exact time. And both of these cloud providers innovate so fast, it's so hard to keep up. And whatever the other thing is, aside from the people aspect, right? Whatever goal you're trying to accomplish by putting something from AWS into Azure or AWS into GCP, chances are you can accomplish that in that same cloud provider. If you're thinking about redundancy and you're like, I don't want one outage at AWS to take me down, put some stuff in US East 1 and put some stuff in US West 1. It's completely separate regions on opposite sides. They will not be impacted by each other if things happen. If you're worried about the portability of your application, well, just build it differently. It doesn't mean you don't have to put it on a different cloud provider. You can use microservices. You can use some of these other modern architectures to build your app to be able to move into a different cloud provider. So I think the operational overhead of maintaining two cloud providers just isn't worth it. And most of the time you can accomplish what you want and use a lot of native services on that particular cloud provider to accomplish what you want without having to compromise your team, your kind of overall infrastructure. And when you have that wide infrastructure, the biggest problem with the cloud is visibility. It's understanding what resources are out there. So if you have two cloud providers, now that's two different areas that you have to look at and manage, and there's bound to have something that's falling between the cracks. I've heard some good arguments about multi-cloud, and I'm willing to listen to them, but I generally challenge it and say, hey, like, what are you trying to accomplish? And you probably can accomplish that on one provider.
This is an incredible point, absolutely incredible point. And, I love the fact that you don't necessarily agree with the kind of the overall, conceptions. There's nothing better than having your own, independent thoughts. And in this particular case, diversity is not necessarily a good thing.
Yeah.
So, and let's jump into kind of the next topic is, why does compliance suck so bad? And getting that done, why does it suck so bad? And I know your slogan for the company is to make it suck less.
Yeah. So I appreciate the question, because it's helpful for me to answer this question.
I just tee you up.
Yeah, it's an easy one. So there's a few reasons. One, compliance has been seen as a check the box exercise. It's been seen as a thing just to get you through so that you can go give it to your sales reps or go give it to a boss and say, hey, we met this thing. That's the only value out of it. So if you make it a paperwork drill where the only thing that you're getting out of it is a piece of paper, no one's going to put forth their best effort because everyone's time is valuable. A compliance assessment involves a lot of people, engineers, HR, legal, a bunch of people have to get involved. And if all of them are just like, hey, I know I have to do this because the compliance person said I have to, so I'm just going to knock it out, no one's going to actually put forth the effort to try to see if they can get better. So that's one of the reasons. And the solution for that is going back to security. Every compliance assessment out there in the technical space is focused on proving that your environment is secure to some third party. So if you just focus on that, am I secure? Am I doing the basics? Am I actually doing what I need to do to improve my environment from a security perspective? The compliance stuff works itself out. And I think organizations, especially nowadays, can get behind security. Security gets a little bit of momentum. People understand security, but people don't really understand compliance. So I think that's the first reason. It's right now it's a check the box exercise. And one of the reasons why it's a check the box exercise is because it's not based on technology. It's not based on technically accurate information. You have non-technical auditors that are asking for screenshots of things that might not make sense. You have auditors that are asking people, prove to me that your AWS environment is physically secure. And you as the organization are like, hey, I don't have any control over that. That's AWS's responsibility. I can't physically go and protect my resources. AWS is going to handle that for me. And that creates this adversarial relationship between client and auditor because the client's like, hey, you're wasting my time with these questions. I know you don't know the technology. I know you don't understand what you're asking. So I'm just going to give you anything to get past it, kind of put the wool over your eyes and show the auditor anything just to get through this. And I think the fix there is twofold. It's on both the auditors and as well as the organization. So I'll start with the organization. A lot of times, and I'm in this space, so I'm constantly talking to customers about what they're expecting in an audit. And the questions usually revolve around costs, time, the kind of the methodology of how it's going to work, but no one really asks about technical capacity. They're not asking, and this is now at ByteChek, even though we have a product that does a lot of the technical work, but also before when I was just a traditional manual consultant, you don't get asked questions about who on your team is going to do my project. What are their technical skills? If you're hosted on Azure, you probably want somebody that knows Azure to assess your environment. You don't want a bunch of AWS guys to assess your environment because while I know a lot about AWS and I can poke around Azure and do things, I don't know the ins and outs of Azure the way that I know AWS. I don't know it to that level of detail. So you don't want me doing your audit. You want somebody that knows Azure very intently and very closely to do that. And those are the questions that I think organizations need to start asking during the scoping process when they're finding an auditor, is saying, hey, like, what are the technical skills of the team? Because that's what you do when you get a pen test or you get anything else that's security related. You ask for the technical qualifications. So we need to start asking for the same thing when it comes to audits. The other thing is the auditors. This idea of being a non-technical auditor has to go away. I don't know why it existed in the first place, because if you're an auditor evaluating a technical environment,
you're gonna upset a bunch of people here.
Hey, that's kind of my thing. But I think auditors have to learn the cloud. They have to learn the technology, and that doesn't mean you have to learn how to code. I'm not saying every auditor needs to go out there and be proficient in Python. While that would help, but it's not necessary. But go out and get a foundational cloud cert like Cloud Practitioner or Azure Fundamentals or whatever it may be. Go out and get a Security Plus if you don't have that, because you should understand some of these basic concepts of how does a VPN work? What is an IPsec tunnel? And understand some of these basics, because if you don't, how are you going to assess it? And how are you going to be able to find weaknesses in their environment if you don't have some of those basic skills? So I do think this is a two-way street to get compliance to where it's more focused on security, where the organization needs to ask better questions, evaluate who they're working with to make sure that they have the technical skills to perform that evaluation. But also the auditors need to step up to the plate and get more technical, learn some more about the technology, because if you're an auditor and you're evaluating cloud environments, guess what? You're a technical auditor, whether you want to be or not. You're now a technical auditor, and you have a responsibility as an advisor and consultant to your client to be able to provide good advice and good consulting. You can't do that unless you know the technology.
And then you also mentioned specifically the shared responsibility model. So why don't we chat a bit about that? First of all, what is it, and where is kind of the line in the sand? And do people that use the cloud, are they aware of it? Are they're familiar with it, or is it something that is kind of ambiguous right now?
Yeah, it's one of those things that I think is the biggest reason for breaches is the lack of understanding of the shared responsibility model, and probably one of the biggest causes of issues in compliance assessments too is the lack of understanding. And what the shared responsibility model is it outlines where is that line drawn between cloud provider and organization. And the way that you can kind of think about it is the cloud providers are responsible for the security of the cloud, and the organization is responsible for security in the cloud. And I'll unpack that a little bit to explain what I mean there. With security of the cloud, it means the physical aspect, the physical building that these servers or somebody else's computer is located in. AWS, Google, Microsoft are responsible for that. You don't have to hire security guards. You don't have to put up the cameras, the big walls, or any of that stuff. They'll handle that for you. The environmental control, that's something that people often forget about. A lot of the air conditioning and raised floors and all those different things that if anybody was an old school auditor from 10 years ago, all those things you used to check when you go into buildings and check for the raised floors and the HVAC systems and the UPSs and all that good stuff. All of that stuff, the cloud provider handles for you. But that's where the line stops. And we'll talk a little bit about different models, but that's basically where the line stops when we're talking about infrastructure as service. And where it starts to get responsibility on the organization is where that data lives. So when you're thinking about something as simple as I'm going to take my current web application tier, I have a web application, right? I have a compute server, I have a database layer, maybe I have a front layer there with like a load balancer and some auto scaling groups and things like that. So you want to move that into the cloud. The first thing you're going to do is put it on the EC2 instance, right? While AWS is going to handle that underlying OS, that they're going to handle that underlying operating system there and that virtual machine, you are now responsible to actually patch that. That's one of the biggest things that people forget about in the cloud is like, oh, I got to patch these too. Yes, you do have to patch them. They're your machines because you now own anything that's on top of that. You own the operating system, you own the data, you own the security groups. So when you create a new EC2 instance, you have to decide how can someone access this EC2 instance? And you do that using a security group, which is just a virtual firewall. And you have to say the IP addresses that are allowed to get to that box, the port that's allowed to get that they're allowed to access that box over. And these are all things under control. And it's all about, you're responsible for data protection. You're responsible for incident response. You're responsible for how your network's set up, your users, all of the things that you're responsible for now in your on-prem environment, you're responsible for in the cloud as well. So the shared responsibility model, I think, David, it's one of those things that's not understood, honestly. It's something that people still miss on. And the biggest thing that I would encourage anyone to do is each cloud provider goes into painstakingly detail about where those responsibilities are drawn because they have to protect themselves. They have to make sure people know, like, hey, that breach was your fault.
It's funny, AJ. You really preempted. I was about to say, like, is there any differences between the cloud providers in terms of the model itself, or where and how they explain it? And I think there should be a disclaimer when you turn the service on. It's got to be one, but where it forces you to go through like a maybe 15-minute training or something that will allow you to it's just like if you don't understand that model, it's like driving without a seatbelt. It really is. And you mentioned something as simple as misconfigure S3 buckets. I mean, we've seen some horrendous leaks, for like millions of records because of somebody. And it's just, and it's just so simple. Now, the other piece is that people don't understand how complex the environment is. I know that, once you start, they call it like cloud sprawl or like, once you start using these services, you turn on a machine, and somebody turns on a machine like it's dev or something, and then they forget about it, and it's on, and it's like it's somewhere, and I think honestly, and again, I'm not a conspirator here, but I think it's by design. I think these cloud providers just want you to leave all those servers like on.
Yeah, you'd have some like default alarms or something going off when you spin something up that's lasted for a while. But yeah, I mean, it's a business model, right? And make it easy for you to spin up resources, and then make it hard for you to remember that they're there.
Yeah, absolutely. So in that regards, once you're aware of that shared responsibility model, can you create a policy around that, or what's in actuality? Like, let's talk to me about, there's one thing about, like a framework of what you're supposed to do. So you have the framework of shared responsibility model, and you have to, what can you do in order for you to really apply that in your kind of day-to-day, cloud deployments?
What I would say is use the native services there available to the cloud provider. And I'll use AWS as an example, but this is relative to Azure and GCP as well, because these cloud providers are, if you go back to kind of your point, David, they're a business, right? So if you think about everything through the lens of AWS as a business, they're creating these security services, they're creating these things that help you address security weaknesses specifically in your AWS environment. So oftentimes what the solution is when people move to the cloud is they move to the cloud, and then the next step they do is go and get all the same tools they were using on-prem and put them on their cloud environment. And to me, that doesn't make a lot of sense, because some of those tools may not play nice with the cloud, but you have specific services in the cloud provider to address specific things. And I'll give an example here. We talked about patching. One of the biggest things with patching is just making sure you do it regularly, right? Making sure nobody forgets it. That's patching in and of itself is not inherently that difficult. You could probably have really anyone patch a few of your EC2 instances, regardless of their skill set in the information security space. But the biggest thing is reminders of doing it regularly and keeping up to date. So
by the way, no, just not to cut you off, but I think even the idea of patching, cloud patching, I don't think people get that. I think it's like, if anything is a takeaway from this conversation, is that once you run stuff on the cloud, servers on the cloud, you have to patch them as well. They're not doing it for you. I don't know if that's clear. I think this is like something that's like, blows my mind when I hear this, because it's just like that. There's a responsibility for you to make sure that there's no recent vulnerabilities on those machines. It's just basic stuff.
No, absolutely. And I think it is something that's overlooked just because of the nature of how easy it is. Like you were saying, to spin up an instance, you just forget that it's an actual server. You're just like, oh yeah, I just hit this little command. I got a new server, and I go do my work. And next thing you know, you have like 30 instances, and
and not just instances. Like, we're talking about services.
Yep.
I mean, Amazon spits out like new services on a weekly basis. Exactly. It's incredible, right? Yep. The dashboard are just insane. So, people are using these tools again that are not totally aware and don't have an in-depth understanding of what it is that they're doing. And then also talk to me about a bit about configuration in the cloud and what the complexity are inherent in that.
Yeah, so I think to kind of wrap up the previous thing with the patching is, like, you use a native service. There's a service called Amazon Inspector. It can run an automatic vulnerability scan every whatever cadence you want. You can combine that with a service called AWS Systems Manager that will then go out right after that scan and automatically patch those EC2 instances. So when we start to talk about configurations, the thing that you should be focused on in the cloud, and I talked about this recently in a SANS talk that I did, is automating security. Because the cloud, like you and I know very well, and we keep talking about how they can have this cloud sprawl, and you can keep spinning up new things and new services over and over again. If you're the one responsible for managing this, and you have a relatively decent sized engineering team or decent sized team, the amount of new things that pop up in your environment, it's going to be impossible for you to keep up with without automation. So when you're configuring things in the cloud, especially from a security perspective, it is extremely important to figure out what can you automate. Something as simple as automating S3 bucket security, being able to automate the encryption, the public settings, all of that good stuff associated with S3 buckets is something that you can do. So a lot of those breaches that we see, I think I just saw a couple of days ago, Hobby Lobby had an S3 bucket that had like over 150,000 records or something that was breached because it was left open. Like all of that's preventable in the cloud. Like, I would say 80% of the breaches in the cloud are preventable through automatic configurations that you could probably do with native services, it's kind of an indictment on those companies, because you could have prevented this pretty easily if you just dove into using some of these services. So what I would say is, there's two things in the cloud: automate security. The other thing is rethink the way that your architecture is set up. A lot of times people just lift and shift. So they take their on-prem environment and just put it directly in the cloud environment and run it the exact same way. So if you're running a MySQL database and you say, I'm just going to take that and put it on the EC2 instance in the cloud, and now I'm in the cloud. Yes, you're in the cloud, but you probably should look into relational database service, which is a managed service for AWS. Now you don't have to worry about the underlying infrastructure of your database. Or maybe you don't even need an underlying infrastructure. You can use Amazon Aurora Serverless. And there's so many different ways that you can take your existing environment and say, how can I make it better in the cloud? Because just taking an existing environment, plopping it into the cloud and not changing anything, you're not really taking full advantage of the cloud provider and using it to your advantage. The other thing I would say is, if you're spending a little bit of money on any of these cloud providers, you have access to support. you have access to resources at these cloud providers that can provide consulting, advice, architecture reviews, and really identify ways to improve your environment. So I think it's kind of like in college, a lot of colleges have those writing centers or those career centers, and nobody ever goes to them. Nobody ever uses them. You're paying all this tuition and you don't even use the resources available to you. It's the same thing on the cloud, where if you're paying a little bit of money, you have access to support, and definitely reach out to them to make sure that you got things configured to take advantage of the cloud.
Yeah, that's very true. And it comes back to simple. Like most of the breaches, I think could have been prevented by acting, pre-breach on fairly simple logic and simple measures, right? So, and after the fact, it's what's the saying? The ounce of prevention is worth like a pound of cure. Yep. I think that's the saying. So, in terms of question that you should be asking your cloud provider up front. Is anything that pops to mind, for, let's say, a CISO looking to join into a new service?
Yeah, I would ask about the biggest thing right now that is the challenge in a lot of these cloud providers is multi-account security. Most organizations, and if you're not, you should have multiple accounts or multiple subscriptions if you're on Azure, or multiple projects if you're on Google, whatever it may be, multiple things in these different cloud providers, because that helps you segment your environment, limit your blast radius, and make sure if something bad happens, it doesn't destroy your entire environment. So I would say when you're looking at a new service or even just looking at moving to the cloud, is figure out how do they help you manage that multiple account strategy so that the overhead on your team is lower. And then I would also ask about support. Like, what type of support can you get from the cloud providers consultants to help you improve your environment, to help your teams? If you don't have a AWS expert on staff, but you have somebody that's really knowledgeable engineer that just hasn't got experience with AWS yet, how can you supplement the in-house or external expertise from AWS to exponentially grow your internal team? I think those are the two questions I would ask about. Luckily, a lot of the cloud providers have just pretty decent documentation out there to outline how to do different things and give you the basics before you dive into the details.
And once you've decided that and you picked one, and hopefully just one,
yep.
What other consideration when you're looking to, let's say, move to application to the cloud or looking to sign up for new services? What type of areas you have to focus on typically?
Yeah, I would say there's 5 main areas of security you should focus on. The first being identity and access management. How are you managing your users? Do you have role-based access control? Make sure you're following the principle of least privilege. All the same things we know about from an on-prem standpoint. The other is detection. How are you going to identify incidents? How are you going to identify bad things from happening? And then with that being said is incident response. When something bad happens, because every security professional doesn't say if I'm breached, it says when I'm breached. When you're breached, what are you going to do? What are you going to do to react to that? So that's another area. The other 2 are infrastructure protection. So similar on-prem, you need to be worried about your network. You need to be worried about what ports you're allowing to certain boxes. You need to worry about the configuration of those servers. What kind of baseline operating system are you using? What kind of baseline configurations or security settings do you have in place? And then, of course, data protection. You got to encrypt your data at rest. You got to encrypt data in transit. You got to make sure that you don't have sensitive data open to the world. That's the difference between the cloud and on-prem is you can put your customer sensitive data out there publicly for everyone to find that they don't want, and you can do it with the click of a button. So you got to make sure that you're protecting your data. So the thing with the cloud, as some of those areas I just listed, identity and access management, detection, infrastructure protection, data protection, and incident response, that's not new concepts, right? It's still the same security concepts we both have learned over the course of our careers. It's just different of how you do them in the cloud. But those are the areas I would focus on.
And you've been involved in a lot of projects, right? For cloud projects for large companies.
Yeah.
What does that process look like? Walk me through like a project to deploy a large system in a cloud environment. What does like the first 30-day, the planning session, the planning phase, the deployment phase, and then the maintenance phase? What does that look like? And any pitfalls in any of these areas that you know of?
I would say the planning phase is the most important, and it's often the one that's the most rushed. So those are that would be a biggest pitfall, is that there's not enough discussions, not about what you want to do, but why you want to do it. Oftentimes I see people, they get all the right people in the room. I'm in there as a consultant. Somebody steps up. They have this nice, pretty PowerPoint deck. It's all, all done up. They spent a lot of time on it, and they're all talking about this is, we're going to move to the cloud. We're going to do this. We're going to do this, and never explain why are they doing it. What are the goals that you're trying to accomplish? So the engineers just go out and build whatever you say. They don't care. It's like, hey, yes, you need me to do that. I'll build it and I'll do it. But then them not understanding the why. You get into the environment, you're like, hey, I thought because we did this, we were going to have faster performance on our website. You're like, well, you didn't say that. You just said you wanted to move it over here. If you would have said that, we would have used CloudFront or put this on a static website on S3 or whatever it may be. So I think the biggest and most important thing is that planning phase. When you have all those stakeholders in the room, don't just go in and say, this is what we're going to do. Explain why you're going to do it and what are the goals you're trying to achieve by moving the application or the entire organization to the cloud. What are the things that you're trying to accomplish? Because oftentimes the way that you go about accomplishing those goals are a lot different than what you originally set out, because there's just better ways to do them as you move to the cloud. The next phase that I often see after that is when you start to do, and usually what I see here is like a small deployment, right? It's like, all right, we're going to put some stuff in S3. All right, we're going to stand up just one instance to see how things work. And it's like this small kind of migration into like a dev environment until you get things up and running, start poking around. And the biggest challenges there are making sure the right pieces are talking to each other. Because in on-prem environment, it's pretty easy. Things are connected, but when you move things to the cloud, you can have some gaps there. So there's a lot of testing there. And that's the thing that I definitely encourage anyone to do, is give yourself a lot of time when you're moving to the cloud or moving an application to the cloud, so that you can make sure all those pipes are working. Because especially when you're thinking about modern web applications, one misconfiguration here could shut everything down. And you really want to make sure those things are working. So move it into a dev or a test or a staging environment before you move it into like an actual production environment. And then lastly, once it's in production, is just monitoring it. There's a great tools out there to make sure you have visibility of the performance of your resources across all the cloud providers. And the biggest thing there is not necessarily getting that information, but how do you digest it? How does your team be able to see it and react to it? Because it's not enough just to log. Because if you log, you're going to have terabytes of data. If you have a modern applications, nobody's looking through all of that. But you need to be able to say, hey, this is an interesting event. This is something that I want to pull out and have somebody look deeper at. And you can use tools to do that. So what I would say just in general is go back to that planning phase. Make sure everybody understands the why. What are you trying to accomplish? Because that's going to help make better decisions.
Well, I think the understanding the why is pretty much a kind of a basic element everywhere. So does it make sense to have compliance woven into the fabric of the deployment, to have that in the back of your mind in terms of what you need to do, to be like PCI compliant, whatever else compliance you have to be under. And when you design and deploy, you are thoughtfully doing that, and it will save you a lot of time and energy in the end. Talk to me about this a bit.
Yeah, it's just like this whole concept of DevSecOps, where it's like a philosophy of shifting security left, where you put security earlier on into the software development lifecycle. And anybody that knows anything about DevSecOps, it's not really, it is about technology and it is about changing some of the ways that you technically do things, but really it's about a philosophy. It's about a mindset. It's about changing the way you think about security. And I think absolutely, David, it's not common that compliance is thought about, to be quite honest, at this stage, but you should be thinking about it, because just like you're saying, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. An ounce of considering compliance at the beginning of your deployment is worth several pounds of remedies later on. Because if you set something up, especially when you're thinking about PCI, PCI is one of those weird ones where scope really matters. And your assessment is narrowed down to the scope of where cardholder data lives. So where do any of those credit card information live? And if you set your environment up right, you can have a really segmented report that's really easy to get through. If you don't, now the entire AWS infrastructure that you set up is all in scope, and you have this very expensive and long audit. So I think understanding not only what frameworks you're currently are required to adhere to. So maybe you're in healthcare and you're currently required to adhere to HIPAA, but maybe on the roadmap for the business, you all are going to start taking payments. You all are going to start processing credit cards. You need to be thinking about PCI then and having those conversations. And this is, again, going back to that planning session. One of the first things that I ask the people to provide me is the meeting invites. Show me who's attending and what are their job titles. Because usually I can find the gaps right there. I'm like, well, you have nobody from security and nobody from compliance here. So this meeting is going to be useless because you're going to set up them for failure later on. Or you'll have nobody from the engineering team. It's like, well, how are we going to talk about all this? Well, they don't need to be involved just yet. Yes, they do. Because they need to know what you're doing and why so that they can make sure that it's not going to conflict with something else that they have going on. So I think in that planning session, you have to talk about what compliance frameworks you're currently responsible to adhere to so that you meet those as soon as you move to the cloud, but also where you're going, because where you're going is going to help. And the other thing that can help is a lot of these cloud providers have reference architectures that you can click a button and get an environment set up that meets a particular standard. For example, AWS has one for HIPAA. You click a button and you get a few instances, you get a few databases, and all of the settings are configured appropriately to meet the HIPAA security rule. So you can get a head start, but you just have to involve compliance personnel early on in the process.
It's a really great approach, and I think it's completely overlooked, right? No one does that today. So you did the right things, you deploy it. It's like Friday, you kick back, you sit on the couch, you open up crack up with a beer bottle. Come Monday, maybe several weeks later, is what's involved in the maintenance of these applications. And as you mentioned, things are rapidly evolving in the space. What kind of things do you need to worry about when we're talking about compliance and cloud security?
The number one thing I would think about is what guardrails can you put in place? What can you do to prevent some of that cloud sprawl, some of these misconfigurations from happening? Because it's impossible for you to see everything. It's impossible for you to be notified every time someone stands up a new EC2 instance and opens it up to the world. You can have all these tools in place and all these systems in place that can start screaming at you if that happens, but it might be too long. It might be too, the biggest thing you want to do in security is say, the time between when you identified an incident and the time between when you respond to the incident, you want that time to get smaller and smaller and smaller. And the way that you do that in the cloud is set these guardrails. And I'll give one very easy example on AWS. You talked about cloud sprawl in these dev environments. One thing that's common that happens is both a security issue and then also just internal is resources being spun up in different regions where you had no intention of doing anything. So say you're a company living in Virginia, you host your data in US East 1, which is in the Virginia area here in the States. And say for some reason you start to see some resources over in AP East 2, the South Asia Pacific region, right? There's no reason for that. And there's actually been companies that have had hackers pop in, spin up resources and do Bitcoin mining in a random region on their behalf. And they don't find out until their bill is $100,000 for running these super instances over there.
Sounds like you encounter something like that.
Yeah, I helped out a client with that, and the fix was simple. And when they found out what the fix was, they were pretty disappointed that they had to pay that $100,000 bill because you use something called service control policies, and you can say, I only want people, or people can only deploy instances in this particular region that I'm hosted in. And now, if somebody tries to go to another region and spin up an instance, they get denied an error. And those are some of the guardrails you can put in place. And same thing with the dev stuff. Developers spin up new resources. They forget about them. They're testing something. Next thing you know, you get that bill. And I personally done that with my own free account where I forget to delete resources.
Listen, that's an amazing nugget right there. Again, amazing. So simple, but yet, you prevent that to happen. So I guess they couldn't ask for forgiveness, or I guess not knowing doesn't let you off the hook. They had to pay the bill.
Once that bill comes through from AWS, you're on the hook. They're going to get the money for sure. They're not going to. That's the shared responsibility model. It applies to your billing too. They're definitely going to take that charge, and it's simple to do. Service control policies are a powerful way to say, these are the basic things that I want to happen in my environment. If anything else happens outside of that, you can't do it. And now as an administrator, you're not worried about if someone's spinning up resources in another region, or you can even set to say, I only want this specific type of EC2 instance deployed, and it has to be configured in this manner. So now every time somebody spins up an EC2 instance, it meets the requirements of your security policy. And again, it's just like, these are the things that you can do that say, all right, I can't prevent everything from happening, but I can prevent the knowns. I can protect myself from the known threats, the known weaknesses, and the known things that may impact me. And that's what I would focus on when you're talking about maintenance, is every day figure out what guardrails can I put in place. And it's going to be hard to do that at first because you kind of need to understand some of the behavior of your application and the behavior of your users. But as you start to figure out, okay, this user has full admin access, but they literally only access RDS. They don't need to have full admin access anymore. Or this particular, we never use this particular service. We never use DynamoDB, but I saw somebody was poking around with it the other day, and now we were charged for it. So just make DynamoDB not allowed to be used. And it's just simple things like that every day I would put guardrails in place to try to figure out how do I eliminate potential weaknesses from presenting themselves.
Yeah, that's absolutely amazing nuggets. So before we wrap up, I want to make sure that we plug in ByteChek. So maybe give me an idea, what do you guys do, how you guys help your customers, and what's kind of the best way to reach out for you to for consultation.
Yeah, absolutely. So at ByteChek, we're a cybersecurity software SaaS company. We built a tool that goes out and connects directly to your cloud environments, the AWS, the Azures that we talked about, as well as cloud applications like GitHub and Jira. And we collect evidence automatically for your audits. And our platform does that for two reasons. One, your time is better spent working on your product and your company and not grabbing screenshots for auditors. And two, those screenshots are probably not accurate, and your auditors probably won't understand them anyways. So we eliminate all of that nonsense and go get technically accurate information directly from the resources where all of that information exists. And this also helps you get a SOC 2, get whatever compliance framework that adds security value to your organization that actually is going to improve the security of your environment. And I'll give an example. We just finished up a SOC 2 type 1 with the customer, and we added some new AWS controls in our platform, and they were able to improve the security of their environment well after the audit. And that's this whole thing that we believe in. There's a saying in the industry where compliance is not security. And I definitely agree with that, but I think security is compliance. And if you focus on security, you will knock out compliance. And that's what we do at ByteChek. We focus on security first, and you will knock out all your compliance assessments. And to reach out to us, obviously you can reach out to me on LinkedIn. My messages are kind of crazy. So I would say to get a better and quicker response, book a meeting off of our website, hop into our chat bot on our website. It's a pretty, if you like memes and GIFs, just go poke around our website because our chat bot will keep you entertained, especially in our learning center. Reach out to us. We love this stuff. We're one of the few people in the world that probably love compliance. So we love talking about it. We love helping, especially smaller organizations, solve some of their compliance challenges, whether that's SOC 2, ISO, HIPAA, CMMC, it doesn't really matter. We specialize in SOC 2. My co-founder is really the authority of truth on SOC 2. He helped write the SOC 2 guide with the AICPA and has founded a few SOC practices. And really just if there's a question about SOC 2, he's the person to ask. So even if you're just going through your SOC 2, you're like, hey, ByteChek looks cool, but I got my own provider, and you just want to talk to somebody about some of the SOC 2 challenges, we love talking about this stuff, and you can definitely reach out and appreciate whoever. I can't see the name there, but it says www.bytechek.com, so appreciate that.
Kind of a quick segue. So just can you define like SOC 2 and why is it so popular? Just for folks that are not completely aware, just so we can wrap it up.
Yeah, no, that's a good. I'm glad you asked me that because it is something that not a lot of people know about, but it's becoming more and more prevalent in the industry. And SOC 2 is a security framework created by the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants. You're probably wondering, why are CPAs involved in security? The AICPA has a set of standards and requirements that they use to come up with the security framework called SOC 2. And the beauty of having a CPA perform the assessment is that they are held to a certain level of standards and scrutiny in the report. So the testing that you have to undergo shows the value of that report. And the way that it's working right now in the industry is, as organizations, business to business organizations, B2B companies work with each other, they're constantly asking each other, hey, David, if you're David company, I'm AJ company, and you're like, AJ company, I want to do business with you. It's looks like you got a cool product there, but I just have one question. How are you going to protect my data? How are you going to protect my information that I put into your product? And I'm like, well, here you go. I'm glad you asked. Here's a SOC 2 report. Or you're going to say, hey, I'm going to sign this deal, but you need a SOC 2. And oftentimes companies are reacting to those requests to run out and go get a SOC 2 report to be able to sell. Honestly, it's a sales enabler. It allows the organization to go out and close new business, but also it's an annual cycle for you to get audited to see how is the security of your environment doing? Is it improving? Are you doing things the right way according to best practices? So SOC 2 is a great way for smaller organizations to prove security to large organizations. And it's honestly becoming table stakes in the business industry, in the B2B space, where you have to get a SOC 2 in order to do business with other people. It's becoming one of those baseline requirements.
I'm thinking, AJ, we should probably start doing sessions about, SOC 2, and then, the different compliance areas within, for cloud. So maybe we'll do that. I feel like we're just scratching the surface of this. So AJ, it's been a real pleasure to have you. Congrats on, taking the plunge and doing your own. I'd love to be hosted over there at one point too. Maybe as part of the panel or something, talk shop. But it's been a real pleasure with some amazing insight and, absolute nuggets for anybody who's looking to deploy cloud or currently has deployment. So please reach out to AJ. He's definitely forward thinking. Not necessarily popular with everybody, like in terms of his conceptions about what needs to be done, but he's definitely on the right track. And all the best. And thank you all for joining. Much appreciated.
Yep. Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.
Take care, all. See you soon.